Good evening, everyone, and a very warm welcome to the first in a series of events about Hinxton Hall that we're calling Georgians, Jet Engines, and Genes. Tonight's event is on hidden heritage and homegrown veg, and it's part of Open Cambridge and Heritage Open Days. My name is Julian Rayner. I'm a white man in my early 50s, very early 50s, with short grey hair and a very short beard. And if you would like to address any questions to me tonight, my pronouns are he and his. I'm a genomics researcher. My lab works on how malaria parasites evolve, how they invade human red blood cells to cause disease, and how to stop them killing 500,000 children every year. But I also have the honor, and it really is an incredible honor, that the team is amazing, of being director of Welcome Connecting Science. At Connecting Science, it's our goal to enable everyone to explore genomics and its impact on research, health, and society. And we work with public audiences, researchers, and healthcare professionals to help people from all walks of life to learn, discuss, and engage with genomics. We're based on the Wellcome Genome campus, which is situated just a few miles out of Cambridge in the UK, and is home to two world-leading research institutes, the Wellcome Sanger Institute and the EMBL European Bioinformatics Institute. This campus is all about the science of genetics and genomics, which is very much in the news right now with non-stop headlines about COVID-19 genome sequences and the variants that they encode, many of which were first identified right here by the Sanger Institute. But life on the Genome campus didn't just begin 30 years ago with the arrival of the Sanger Institute and the EMBL EBI. The campus is built on the footprint of the Hinxton Hall estate. And in fact, myself and many members of my team are lucky enough to have offices in Hinxton Hall itself. Because we see it every day, it's easy for us to take for granted that we work in a grade 2 listed building. And for those other people on the campus, even if their office isn't inside it, the hall and its surrounding buildings have just become a regular feature of working life. In fact, Connecting Science's courses and conferences program take place in what was part of the hall stable block and kitchen garden, as well as what used to be formal parlors and dining rooms. As I've said, it's easy for us to take those surroundings for granted, but a few years ago, just before the pandemic, I and some members of my team started to reflect more on the history that was contained within the walls of Hinxton Hall and the wider estate around it. When Wellcome bought the hall and estate in the early 1990s, they invested in restoring some of its original features, and we've been able to build on that work as well as research by others to explore its origins. We've now developed that work into an online exhibition on life at the hall through the ages, as a family home, as part of a community, and now as a home for science. The exhibition includes many generous contributions from local residents and people who've worked here, as well as some people who work here now. The first part of this story is told in this film, which we'll show in a second, but before it does, I'll briefly audio describe it. The film starts with sweeping aerial footage of Hinxton Hall, a grand red brick Georgian building set within expansive gardens. At the center of the building is a black door surrounded by white pillars on either side. It has two wings on either side of it, with the right extending out further than the left. Throughout the film, photographs connect to a moving timeline illustrating the narration of the film. Halfway through the film, the camera shows details from inside the building, such as white marble figures, murals of cherubs, and mythical creatures and gilded ceiling decorations. The timeline continues with sepia images of an earlier 20th century family, followed by World War II graphics, and then black and white photographs of servicemen and women. The film closes with more panning footage of the hall and then goes to the credits. The voiceover is by Claire Kingston, with music by Dan Phillipson. Welcome Connecting Science is funded by Wellcome, and the film is produced by Dragonlight Films. And the film will follow now.
Hinxton Hall is one of the oldest and most admired buildings within the Wellcome Genome campus. The building as we know it was built in the mid-18th century. However, its story begins much earlier. The name Hinxton is of Saxon origin, meaning Hengest's farm, and there is archaeological evidence of people living in the area at this time. Other names include Hestitona, Horsetitona and Hinxton. The Hinxton Hall estate and the village of Hinxton have been intertwined across centuries. By 1086, a village settlement was well established and recorded in the Domesday Book. Hinxton had 38 inhabitants, 268 sheep, 69 swine and 1 horse on record, which suggests that farming and weaving were the main activities of the village. The first documented evidence of any building on the site comes from the early 1700s, when Joseph Richardson of Horseheath built a modest house here. It was described by a local as a pretty neat box and designed as a fishing retreat known as Trout Hall. This association explains not only the 18th century fish ponds, but also the trout carvings to be seen around the site, which the main building incorporated as a tribute to the original name. In 1748, Richardson sold it to Thomas Brown of Ickleton. In 1756, Brown's nephew Richard Holden gave it to his daughter Mary, whose husband was John Bromwell Jones. Jones was the person responsible for the demolition of the first house on the site and the building of a new hall between 1748 and 1756. This is the heart of the central 3-storey block and basement of Hinxton Hall, which exists today. Jones also built stables, a kitchen garden and fruit orchard suitable for a wealthy Georgian family. Over the next 100 years, the hall passed through 3 more families, including the Vachels and the Greens. The hall and grounds were extended with 2 new wings, a game larder and pump house. In the early 19th century, the Greens changed their name to the de Freville family and became the owners of the hall. They undertook significant alterations to the house and its grounds. In around 1840, enhancements were added, including a portico entrance to the east facade, a library to the north wing, and a further extension to create a new kitchen, offices and bedrooms. It was at this time that the interior of the hall was enriched with decorative elements that were popular at the time, reflecting the experiences of the wealthy social elite. They went on a grand tour of Europe, taking in sights of classical antiquity and Renaissance art. These travels influenced the interior decoration, resulting in the Pompeian parlour drawing room being created. The hall pleasure grounds were also enhanced, with ornamental shrubs, trees and pathways to the lakes. In 1884, the de Frevilles acquired the neighbouring site of Hinxton Grange from the Nash family. This expanded the Hinxton Hall estate property to nearly 100 acres, which was described as one of the best partridge manors in the eastern counties. The hall was used for local events and celebrations, with a regular flower and garden produce show held in its grounds from the late 1800s. The hall also provided a source of employment to local residents of the village. Records show a chauffeur, a cook, a butler, housemaids, kitchen maids, gamekeepers, a groom, a footman, and several gardeners. The entire Hinxton Hall estate was sold to Mr. Robert Bertram Wilkinson in 1900, who had different tenants live there until 1917. Then it was bequeathed to Robert Wilkinson's sister Ethel, her husband Charles Robinson, and their 3 children Laura, Rita and Charlie Robinson. Laura and Rita remained in the hall until after the Second World War. During the war years, the hall and its grounds were occupied and used for billeting soldiers from the British Army, Royal Air Force, Women's Auxiliary Air Force and American forces. They were spread across the estate in tents and nissen huts. The Air Ministry wanted the Robinson sisters to leave the hall during this time, but they were permitted to stay in a flat at the top of the building following an intervention by their cousin, a brigadier in the British Army. The war years saw the hall lose much of its 18th century panelling, and its iron gates were removed for smelting to support the war effort. By 1953, the estate consisted of around 40 acres, including the Hall Park and pleasure grounds, and belonged to Sir Robert Philip Wyndham, a Dean of Babraham. He sold it that year for £25,000 to Tube Investments Limited, which converted the hall and grounds into office space and research labs. This marked the beginning of a new chapter in the history of the Hinxton Hall, one that would lead to great scientific progress and discovery.
So if you've never visited our campus, I hope that provides a small glimpse of the hall and the estate. Tonight we'll be concentrating on the 19th century, but we'll also share some interesting and unexpected connections to the current research taking place on the site. Our panel tonight has explored some of the hall's hidden secrets, and we'll also be discussing the challenges of capturing stories and creating an exhibition during a pandemic. Just before I hand over to our chair for this evening, I'd like to take a moment to tell you about the format and briefly run through the event housekeeping. We respectfully ask everyone to participate in a spirit of curiosity and sharing, respecting different views, identities, and experiences. The platform is being moderated to ensure that it's a safe and inclusive space for all. Once I stop talking, the panel will chat for about 50 minutes and then hand over to questions from you. And we'd really love your contribution, so please don't be shy. You'll see a Q&A box, which will be either at the top or bottom of your screen, depending on the device you're using. Please type your questions in there at any point throughout the whole event, as soon as they occur to you. Don't worry if it looks like you're the only one asking a question. All your questions will come in on a feed to us, and my colleague is working behind the scenes to collate them so that we can cover as many topics in the Q&A at the end as possible. And now it's my great pleasure to hand over to Helen Carr to introduce our panel in more detail. Helen is an acclaimed historian, writer, and TV producer and podcaster, specializing in medieval history and public history. She's the author of the best-selling biography of John of Gaunt, The Red Prince, and is the co-author and editor of What is History Now?, a volume of essays that discusses how we understand and interpret our past in our present. It's a great pleasure to have you hosting the event tonight. Over to you, Helen.
Thank you, Julian, for that lovely introduction, and it is great to be here tonight. Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us to hear our expert panel discuss the fascinating history behind Cambridge's Hinxton Hall, the now home of the Wellcome Genome campus. So as Julian has quite rightly already introduced me, my name is Helen Carr. I am a white woman in my mid-30s with long brown hair, and my pronouns are she or her. I am a historian, writer, producer, and podcaster, and my area of special interests and knowledge is a bit further back in history than Hinxton Hall. I'm a medieval historian, and as Julian has said, I've authored or edited 2 books, The Red Prince, a biography of John of Gaunt, the Duke of Lancaster, and a volume of essays called What is History Now?, which is a follow-up to my great-grandfather E.H. Carr's 1961 seminal work, What is History? So over this last week, when I have been preparing for this, I have really enjoyed finding out about Hinxton Hall, not least because I too am a local, as I live in Cambridge. Thank you so much for inviting me, and I hope you will all enjoy the event as much as I will. As we've seen in the film, Hinxton has played an important role in Cambridgeshire since the 11th century. Since being invited to chair tonight's conversation, I have become fascinated in how this once grand home has been developed over these centuries. What came before it, when was it built and by whom, And how has it become a centre of innovation and research? So I'd like to introduce our panel tonight to tell us more about this hidden gem. The architectural historian Georgio Bol, garden historian Twigs Way, Wellcome Sanger Institute scientist Max Brown, exhibition consultant Catherine Halgrove, and filmmaker Colin Ramsey. My first guest tonight is Georgio Bol. Georgio is an architectural historian specialising in 18th and 19th century painted interiors. During his master's degree at the University of Cambridge, he made the Pompeian Room at Hinxton Hall the topic of his research, providing the most comprehensive and up-to-date history of the room to date. He has now shifted his focus towards the study and research of old master paintings. I'd like to start with some information on the building of Hinxton Hall in the 18th century. So, Georgio, can you tell us a bit more about your dissertation research? It sounds absolutely fascinating.
Thank you, Helen, for the introduction. Hi, everyone. My name's Georgio Bol. I'm a white man in my mid-20s with short brown hair and brown eyes, and my pronouns are he or him. And I'm delighted to be here to talk about the Pompeian Room at Hinxton Hall, which is the topic I picked for my dissertation. My research was mostly divided into two parts. The first part of my study was focusing on retracing the room's history back to its origins, with the aims of finding out who built the room, when they built it, and why. And the second half of my study focused on the original wall paintings themselves, with the aims of finding out to what extent the decorative scheme of the room is archaeologically accurate. What I was most interested in was the appropriation and recontextualization of the visual culture of the ancients and how it was transposed and readapted to a British 19th century setting.
So Hinxton wasn't the only place that sort of adopted this style, this this revival of antiquity. How and why was the Pompeian style adopted in England during the 18th and 19th centuries? Why was it so popular?
Well, ever since the Vesuvian cities of Pompeii and Herculaneum were rediscovered in the mid-18th century, their story has never ceased to fascinate visitors from all over the world. The fate of these cities offers a paradox of the survival of the past. It is only through the eruption of Mount Vesuvius in 79 AD and their subsequent destruction that mankind has been able to rediscover their past, which was providentially preserved under layers of solidified lava and volcanic ash. From the excavation of the Vesuvian cities, we witnessed the expansion of classical interior decoration through figures like Robert Adam and James Athenian Stewart. The rediscovery of the ancient cities sparked a renewal of interest in Roman antiquity and the development of archaeological inquiry, but it also ensured that its aesthetics and decorative motifs were appropriated and adapted to the beliefs and necessities of the 18th century elite. So through this process of adaptation, classical civilization became a symbol of fashionableness, taste, and refinement. Throughout the late 17th century, travel on the continent became increasingly popular amongst the British aristocracy. It was common for many British young men of wealth to undertake a grand tour as a means of completing their education. In fact, it was believed that upon their return, they would be ready to enter into adult society, having been imparted with a certain taste and knowledge about the world. And as travelers steadily discovered the artistic and architectural heritage of Italy, its influence became increasingly significant upon Britain. More specifically, the extension of the Grand Tour to southern Italy and the gradual dissemination of publications regarding the progress of the Vesuvian excavations stimulated the imagination of British architects and artists to create a style inspired by the recently discovered cities. This contributed to the emergence of a new style of interior decoration inspired by the wall paintings of Pompeii and Herculaneum, and it became known as the Pompeian style. So by the end of the 18th century, rooms in country houses all over England and Europe copied and reinterpreted the antique style, which is characterized by strong colors and figurative panels, of which the Pompeian Room at Hinxton is a really good example.
The Grand Tour sounds like a more refined gap year that young men and women go on today. Much more refined, I think. Okay, so what is the history of the hall more specifically, and even more specifically of the Pompeian Room, because that's obviously the room that you conducted most of your research on?
Yes, so as you saw by the video, the first substantial house was built by a man called Joseph Richardson of Horseheath. He then sold the property in 1748 to Thomas Brown of Ickleton, who settled it onto his niece Mary. And then it's her first husband, John Bronwell Jones, who pulled down the original house built by Richardson and built the central portion of the hall as we know it today, between 1748 and 1756. The estate was then purchased by a certain Edward Green in 1798. He was a Cambridgeshire gentleman with a really large inherited fortune who had travelled extensively himself across Italy. It was then his son, Green de Freville, we're just going to call him Edward de Freville for now, who in the following years built the Pompeian Room in around 1845. So like many like it across the country, the Pompeian Room was originally intended as a drawing room. It seems that it was built for a couple of reasons. The first being Edward's marriage to a lady called Julia Flower in 1846. In fact, it was rather common during this period to have houses expanded and redecorated before one married, as a sort of gift and preparation for married life. She was a lady of high rank with numerous influential connections. It is therefore likely Edward had the room commissioned as a celebration of his marriage, but also his entering into a higher sphere of society. He also entertained largely at Hinxton. He therefore must have needed a mansion fit for a man of his stature and decorated in the latest fashion. The celebration of their marriage could also have been depicted on the west wall of the Pompeian Room. This is the wall directly opposite the two windows, and it has a central dark blue section flanked by two rectangular ochre panels. The one to the left-hand side depicts musical instruments and sheets of music, probably alluding to the function of the room as a drawing room, and the middle depicts two heads, one male, one female, with a sword and a trumpet crossed behind them. The panel to the right displays a jewel case with two arrows and then two doves kissing in the middle. There clearly is a theme here. I mean, the male and female figures together with the doves kissing probably depict Edward and Julia. In fact, according to some family history notes I found, the couple spent a most happy life as they had no kids. Additionally, the mix between these kind of military and musical items could be a representation of the couple's interests, considering Edward was a major and captain in the Cambridge militia. Marriage, fashion, and entertainment might not have been the only reasons behind the decoration of the Pompeian Room. It is in fact likely that Edward de Freville also had the room built as a tribute to his father after inheriting his travel diaries, and after having travelled extensively himself, decided to decorate the room in the Pompeian style. As I mentioned earlier, Edward's father had undertaken an extensive grand tour across Europe. And as I discovered from reading his personal diaries, his travel diaries, he had particularly been struck by the wall paintings of Pompeii, which he had visited himself in 1793. His son might have not been the intellectual and grand tourist his father was, but the room is definitely imbued with an undisputable fascination for the classical world, which is very much representative of the impact the Vesuvian excavations exerted from the mid-18th century onwards onto British aristocracy.
So it's amazing how much you can really tell from one room in the way that it's decorated. So from this we're understanding that it is a place of entertainment and a way to express personal interest, but also place one's place within society. but then it also represents a much larger interest. You know, you're talking about the excavations that are taking place during this time, and it was really a period of, I suppose, a period of research. I mean, do you think that this can tell us about more of an expansive taste for the antiquity of the British 19th century elite?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the Pompeian Room is characterized by an eclectic mix of classical and 19th century elements, which are arranged in a seamlessly random fashion, depicting illusionistic landscapes, enthroned Roman gods, mythical creatures, and delicate female figures. Some of the painted elements are actual direct copies from Roman houses. However, others are clearly 19th century adaptations. The predominant colors in the room are actually dark blue, ochre, and red, which create a framework for the figurative panels. The colors are arranged in an analogous way to original Pompeian wall paintings, the lowest panels being the darkest and the uppermost the lightest of all. The Pompeian inspiration is evident, however, it's not wholly consistent and serves as a representation of fashion, knowledge, and personal taste of its occupants. They probably had no real interest in recreating an archaeologically accurate reconstruction. There are a couple of great examples demonstrating the extent of readaptation and recontextualization of Pompeian ornaments and figurative themes to a British 19th century setting. I think the most striking is perhaps a cherub on the west wall, which is riding a chariot drawn by ducks rather than swans, which were typically depicted in Pompeii. Another great one can be seen in one of the small vignettes adorning the lower portion of the south wall. This is the large wall to the right upon entering the room. The use of vignettes was incredibly popular in Roman houses to depict still lives. However, in this case, we can see the depiction of a red squirrel eating nuts. This theme is clearly of British inspiration, the red squirrel being a native British animal that was, never to be found in Roman wall paintings.
I feel like your visual analysis is, I can almost see it right in front of me without actually even seeing the paintings. But I mean, these are incredible insights, and thank you so much. I need to remind everyone, please do ask lots of questions. I know I've got loads, but I would now like to introduce you to our next expert panelist. So thank you so much, Giorgio. I thought that was fascinating. Thank you. Twiggs Way. Twiggs is a garden historian, writer, and researcher. Twiggs is fascinated by the past and intrigued by the role of flowers, gardens, and landscape in art and culture of all kinds. Her talks and books reflect that endless curiosity, with books on plants and gardens exploring themes of symbolism and meaning, class and gender, art and literature. Every plant has a tale to tell, every garden a past. That's a lovely way of putting it. She also undertakes research and reports for private clients and public bodies, and enjoys training community groups in historic and landscape research. Twiggs is an accredited Art Society lecturer, and her History of the Chrysanthemum in Art and Culture was published by Richtian in 2020. I hope I pronounced that right. Twiggs, thank you so much for joining us. When was the garden at Hinxton built, and what was it used for?
Right, well, that's a fantastic question. I'll just describe myself first. You've done a wonderful précis of me, so I'll just physically describe me. I'm a white woman in my early 30s with very, very short grey hair. I'm wearing big, large glasses today, and I'm a she or a her if anybody wants to address questions to me. So when was the garden at Hinxton built, and what was it for? Well, we're very much focusing tonight in my questions on the walled gardens, so rather than the park and the pleasure grounds, I will mention them. And there is a little bit of a mystery there. So although the video confidently said, Jones created this in the mid-18th century, in fact, although we might guess there was at least one walled garden there in the mid-18th century, because any respectable house had a walled garden, we don't really have a documentation for it until 1804. We're going to come back to that mystery at the end of my little bit. So we know there were at least 2 walled gardens there by 1804, because we have a sales document, and we can be fairly sure if they're selling it with 2 walled gardens or more. It actually says walled gardens. So we know if they're in the sale document, they'll be expecting them to be there. So we can be fairly sure about that. The sales document also describes the house, I should say, as having pleasure grounds, lawn, plantations, orchard, cold bath, fish ponds, and dove house well stocked. So they repeat that in 1806, in fact, pretty much word for word, except by that time there is a shrubbery, walks, a greenhouse, and a hothouse. Now, that doesn't mean they weren't there before in 1804, it's just that they've listed them now. They're probably getting a bit desperate to sell it, so they're really pulling out stops and telling you about everything. So the walled garden, the one that still survives, that everybody will know and love. So the walled garden was described in 1806 as occupying just over an acre. It was situated then in a separate bit to the house. So it was situated in a place called Dove House Close, and it was divided into 2, and it was said to contain the choicest of fruit trees. We don't know what else it contained, but it contained the choicest of fruit trees. And in many ways, it was quite unusual because it was a detached garden. So the park that surrounds the house now wasn't actually there at that time. And you would actually physically have had to come out of the house, cross a public road, and then enter the walled garden that lay to the west. So there's a little bit of a mystery about that. That's very unusual to have your productive garden, you know, in a detached bit, the other side of the public road. However, there was also a little kitchen garden. And again, we know this from the sales document in 1806. This actually adjoined the house, apparently on the south side of it, in a very limited small area of pleasure grounds. And the walled garden, we are told, this little walled garden, we don't know the exact size, but it also contained choice fruit trees, not the choicest, just choice ones. And this subsequently disappears under 19th century, 18th, 19th century rebuilds, possibly as disappearing as early as the mid-19th century. So they seem to be very rich in fruit. So we know that East Anglia in Cambridgeshire is still a centre for fruits and jams, with places like Chivers, for example. And Hinxton seems to have followed that pattern. What else was it for? Well, as we will find out in a minute, it was really for providing for the kitchen garden, but it also provided employment for the village, entertainment for everybody, and indeed education for the gardeners, as well as providing for the kitchen. So it was pretty good value, whatever it was.
So particularly in regard to its produce, what were the more personal elements to the garden? I mean, you've talked about how it was abundant with fruit. Was there a way that this garden was organised on a more personal level?
So it was organised in a fairly, so there's sort of 2 questions to that. There's kind of, why was it organised? How was it organised? And also the personal elements. So the way it was organised was very much in a way that walled gardens are nearly always organised there. And I'm talking here about the larger one that we still have, so that we can talk about much more easily, in that they have a standardised set, really. The reason that they're actually walled is to provide a lot more heat and protection for the crops inside them. So, and in order to do that, the walls are quite cunningly kind of placed so that you will normally have the long wall is the north wall and the south wall, because both of those will have a south face to them, if you can just imagine that. And the shorter walls are usually the east walls and the west walls. The reason is because you want a really long south-facing wall, because that's the best wall to put all your really nice warm fruits and vegetables on. So most walled gardens are rectangular, which the one we have surviving is. although there's a little bit of a mystery to it again, because one part of it only has 3 walls because it goes down to the lake. So it was really used as part of a very long-standing tradition of the upper classes, that they would maintain fish ponds, dove houses, piggeries, productive gardens, all the rest of it. Very much so that they could offer really splendid hospitality to their fellow country house owners. So it was a personal thing. It was kind of a status thing. But there's also something a little bit more personal element to gardens in the terms of productiveness. And again, I'm going to go back to apples, I think, for this. Because throughout the 19th century, there was an absolute fascination with producing a huge range of new cultivars of all different types of fruits and vegetables. So at one stage in the 1850s, there's a new book come out, 10 volumes trying to identify all the different fruits and vegetables available. And these would have been, I know, it's incredible. We think we've got a good deal if we can find 6 varieties of apple in the supermarket. But we still have some of these names today. So, and each of them tells a story. I love stories. So in Rest Park, Bedfordshire, the head gardener was a Mr. Snow, and he introduced Snow's matchless cauliflowers. Egremont russet, we all know as an apple. They're quite popular now. That was first recorded in 1872 and raised by the head gardener of the Earl of Egremont in Petworth, Sussex. So, and there are lots of varieties local to Cambridgeshire, and I like to think that these were grown. They were almost certainly grown in Hinxton, and they have personal names. So Lord Burleigh was a very red-cheeked apple that originally came, as you guess, from up at Burleigh, and was created by the gardener at Burleigh, Mr. Matheson, in 1834. Cambridgeshire nurseryman, right close to Cambridge where you are, was produced Huntingdon Codlin in 1885 by the nurseryman Woods and Ingrams. And there was a Histon favourite by John Chivers. So you have this real list of personal names. And I'm really on the search for a named apple that was associated with Hinxton. So either through a gardener that was at Hinxton, or maybe the Hinxton name itself. And there are thousands of apple namings. And one day I am sure we are going to find one and put it back in the Hinxton fruit and vegetable garden. Either an apple, a cauliflower, a lettuce, I don't mind what it is, but I am searching for one named after a gardener at Hinxton.
Thank you, Twigs. All that talk of apples is making me think of how many delicious apple varieties there might be, which brings me on to our next panelist. And thank you so much, Twigs. If anyone has any questions that they would like to ask Twigs at the end, please remember to put them in the Q&A box on your screen. So I'd like to introduce Max Brown. Max is a senior bioinformatician. That was a mouthful. At the Wellcome Sanger Institute, working on the Tree of Life. He works on the excellent genome data generated by the Darwin Tree of Life teams, including butterflies and moths, apples and oak trees, and is particularly interested in plants and the interaction between ecology and genomics. Max, welcome. Can you explain the process of sequencing organisms and how this work has developed at the Wellcome Genome campus?
Hi, yeah, of course I can. Before I go into it, I'll just do my description as well. I'm Max Brown. I'm a white male in my mid-20s with short brown hair, and my pronouns are he and his. Yeah, so the process of sequencing organisms is a huge topic, and I'm really gonna scratch the surface, but questions are most welcome at the end if I haven't clarified anything. So sequencing organisms really means reading the DNA, and DNA is made up of these 4 bits of information, these 4 letters, A, G, C, and T. And so what we're really doing is reading really long strings of these letters. And so to sequence, of course, we have to extract the DNA first out of the organism. And depending on what kind of organism that is. It could be a plant or a little fly or something. It could be challenging, but you want to get at the nucleus, and so you want to mash up the cells and dissolve the DNA into a solution. And essentially, when we're doing this, we're breaking up the DNA into smaller pieces. What we do next is we send our DNA sample to a sequencing machine. There are loads of different ones, but they all do the same thing. They read the DNA and they send back text files, essentially, of those 4 letters. But they're really big and they're fragmented because they've taken the whole genome, the totality of the DNA in your organism, and they've shredded it into little bits. And so now comes the huge task of taking these shorter reads of DNA and assembling them back together. And so there's been a huge amount of research in algorithms to assemble these short bits of DNA. And we're getting better now at extracting and sequencing longer and longer and longer bits of DNA. And so the genomes are getting better and better and better. And I guess the holy grail is to assemble the DNA that you've extracted into as many bits as there are chromosomes in your organism. So we as humans have 46 chromosomes, or 23 pairs, and apples, for example, have 17 pairs of chromosomes. And yes, that's how we sequence organisms. And what I do is I take this data at the end and try and do something interesting with it. We try and investigate the biology of the organism. You can use it to compare different organisms together. And really, it's a whole magical world of trying to understand these 4 letters. So, yeah.
You say, can all of this explain the evolutionary history of apples? And does that tie into the Apple Day project, which is something you're working on?
Yeah. So there have been attempts in the past to use genetic markers to resolve how and where apples were first came from and where they were domesticated. And what we now know is that apples were originated in the Far East, in China and the Tian Shan mountain range. And here, a closely related group of wild Central Asian apples sort of gave rise to the proto-apple that we see today. And over 7 to 10 million years, large mammals like bears, we hypothesize, gradually selected the biggest and juiciest apples. And so they sort of pre-domesticated the apples for humans to come in and take the pickings. And then along the Silk Road, aided by horses, apples traveled west. And eventually they reached Europe. And along the way, they crossbred with different species of apple. And this has sort of given rise to what we would recognize today as an apple. And a huge innovation, Twiggs was mentioning the huge diversity of apples that we have. And really, this has been helped by what's called grafting, which was discovered around 4,000 years ago by, I think, the Romans or the Roman Empire. And you can take a tree and you can immortalize it. You can say, this is the cultivar, and we're going to name this tree. And so you can spread this particular tree, and it doesn't change over time, which is what happens if you let apples breed by themselves. They crossbreed and introduce different variation from other apple trees, but that's not necessarily what you want if you have the perfect apple tree in front of you.
Is this got to do with the Darwin tree of life? Can you explain what that
Yeah,
is?
so the Darwin tree of life is this huge effort to sequence the genome of every eukaryote in Britain and Ireland, and eukaryote is every living thing apart from bacteria, basically. And so that's around 70,000 species. It's a mind-boggling number and a huge goal to achieve. And I think we're going to do it. But why are we doing this? I mean, it's a huge effort to do. And I think what we really want to do is understand the evolution of diversity of life and uncover new biology of organisms which we would never know about. And a huge part of it, and what I really like about it, is that it's pure open science, and that these genomes that are being produced are free for the world to use. And so they really are this huge legacy, and it will allow anyone all over the world to use this data and for their own research, which could be population genetics, it could be conservation, it could be breeding from anything from animals to plants. It could look at evolution or even medicine. There's a huge amount of untapped potential there. So yeah.
Thank you so much, Max. I don't think I'm going to look at apples in the same way after this evening. There's lots of questions coming through now, which is great. So keep them coming. So my final guests tonight have their respective creative interpretive skills to tell the stories behind this fantastic site. Catherine Halcrow. Catherine is a director of Outside Studios, an interpretation exhibition consultancy founded in 2008, which specialises in heritage sites and outdoor spaces, and has delivered diverse projects from a giant outdoor working model lock in a science garden to the recreation of Jimi Hendrix's flat. Catherine has been working with Connecting Science for several years on ways to present the fantastic scientific heritage of the Hinxton site, and the Hall project has been a real opportunity to ground it in its wider historic context. Colin Ramsey is a filmmaker and director of Dragonlight Films and has produced and directed dozens of short films, documentaries, and commercials for clients, including quite a list of excellent places: the United Nations, Historic England, the University of Cambridge, UNESCO, the Wellcome Genome Campus, and Bear Grylls. His documentary films have featured in Nature magazine, BBC Click, Cambridge Science Festival, and international film events. In 2017, Colin won the Arts and Humanities Research Council, the AHRC, Best Research Film of the Year for his documentary film, Pain in the Machine. I'm delighted to introduce both Catherine and Colin, but we're going to begin with Catherine. So Catherine, what was your experience of curating an exhibition during a pandemic? I can't imagine that was easy. What were the compromises, but also the major challenges?
Okay, well, hello everyone. Thanks very much for having me here. Briefly, as everyone else has done, white woman, long curly hair and glasses, late 40s, sadly, and she, her, if anyone wants to address me. Yes, so I think our first meetings on this project were in January 2020, so really very immediately before the pandemic hit. And I think, I mean, it's an introduction exhibition really to themes which, although they haven't been presented here before in this way, they have been well researched. So we had great sources such as Georgio's dissertation. There's a great Royal Society paper on the tube investment work. There's archaeological dig reports, obviously, things like that. So they were all available and remained available. But yes, as soon as the pandemic and lockdown hit, I mean, of course, everybody was had their own sort of personal battles, homeschooling, all the rest of it. We were all juggling. But our client was immediately at the forefront of a global health emergency, and things like sequencing COVID variant DNA was kind of a priority. And the contacts that we were working with were involved in setting up the campus for COVID safe operation, and it was just very hard for us all to get hold of each other and to focus on the project. So it's kind of like those bullet time sequences in the Matrix, or wading through treacle, you know, everything that would normally be quite simple and well-trodden pathways just became very slow. But yeah, we did have impacts on how we resource the exhibition. It's very asset heavy, so we were looking for original images, and for that sort of thing you're very reliant on museums, on record offices, and these places have scanning operations, and some of the images that we used are meters wide, so we needed very high resolution scans, and everybody was on furlough, and all those departments were just closed. So yes, there were a few impacts.
Yeah, I suppose you had to, you know, take the attention away from the more tangible pieces and rely so heavily on images and archive, which you know, must have been quite restrictive for you.
Well, in a way, but the exhibition was always intended to be that, because it was the brief was that this was a conference centre. It's publicly accessible. There's not really room in the spaces for cases and things like that. So it was always going to be asset heavy. But each theme, there are 4 themes dealing with different phases of the history, and each has its own sort of mural and elevation, but there is also what we called a talking point for each one, and those were really intended to be little sculptural things on the wall, objects, which would catch your attention. And if you're trying to strike up a conversation with someone at a conference, then that might be something that starts you off. And so we were looking for sort of visually interesting things to represent each theme, and they got a bit tricky as well, particularly the one for the innovation theme. So we were chasing the story of the ejector seat headrest, which I think appears in Colin's film, which is about the superplastic aluminium story out of Tube Investments. And we just, every lead that we had ran into the same pandemic issues. We couldn't get people were furloughed. And so, yeah, we went back to what we first thought of in that one. We used a bike, because Tube Investments made bikes as well. So that was handy, much easier to get hold of.
Very resourceful.
Always got a backup.
Yeah. What were your favourite aspects of the exhibition? What are you most proud of in this?
Well, really pleased that we got it done, which I think was a real a testament to how hard the team worked on it, and pulling it together in spite of all those obstacles. But I think that my favourite things, I've always loved the Tube Investment story, but we were involved in that before this project as well, so that was a bit more of an old friend on this project. I was really delighted to find the photograph of the infantry unit that was stationed at Hinxton in the war, taking their tanks down Hinxton High Street on manoeuvres, and to display that so locally to where it was taken, where people whose houses are in that image might see it. It's just fantastic. And that was one where the Imperial War Museum digitization department were all furloughed, and we waited months for them to come back and just to get that photo so that we can use it. So that was fantastic.
Yeah, that is fantastic. And what, I mean, remarkable that photo actually exists of Hinxton High Street itself during that period. How do you feel it's worked out, the whole exhibition?
Well, it seems to be going down really well. I think somebody said it looks like it's always been there, which is I'm taking that as a huge compliment, because it's quite it's a corridor space, a sort of circulation space. Corridor doesn't do it justice at all. It's a circulation space, so there's already a lot going on, lots of doors and signs and pillars and windows and more doors. So it's great to feel that it really fits in there, and actually I feel pulls the space together. But I was there the other day putting some final touches in, and just hearing people talk about reading it and it being interesting. I think it's nice for us that we work a lot in heritage and are interested in where these stories come from and what their roots are. But of course, this is a campus which is entirely almost entirely focused on the now and the future. So I think for a lot of people whose lives are that pointing in that direction, it's a real novelty to have the opportunity to sort of browse a little bit of the history of where they're working. It's nice to hear that that's going down well.
Thank you so much, Catherine. That's wonderful, and it's really lovely to hear actually your perspective on it, because it's rare that when one walks around an exhibition you get to hear how the curator actually sort of put it together and the challenges that they face. So thank you so much, and congratulations. Colin, thank you for joining us as well. It'd be great to get your input on your involvement with all of this. So what was the process around working with Archive for this exhibition? You know, what sort of things were available to you?
Thanks for inviting me, and thanks for the intro, Helen. I'm just going to do my intro. So I'm a white man in my early 40s, and I've got short brown hair. And so yeah, similar to Catherine, the challenges of having to pivot once the pandemic hit. So originally commissioned in December of 2020, and then the pandemic hit and went into lockdown. So originally had loads of interviews lined up, face-to-face interviews. Obviously all filming had to stop. So we had to pivot and think, what could we do within those restrictions to still produce a film of high quality? And it's just around, similar to Catherine's process, well, diving into the history. I want to name check Katrina Robinson, Irene Dutton and Sophia Torelli as well, been incredibly helpful, sifting through a lot of information, helping us gather all the archive material. So yeah, diving down with a cup of tea and the life and times of Hinxton, which is a local book written by the church warden's wife, I believe, Virginia Walker. So reading that book, heritage statements, architectural plans, Georgio Bol's thesis. So deep diving into all that information, sifting through what we can use visually into a film, and within the limitations of a 10-minute film as well. So you can't include everything. You have to be quite ruthless with what you choose. All the photos, letters. I was really glad that Hinxton was in the Doomsday Book as well. So that gives us a kind of starting point for the history, which everyone can kind of anchor onto. And then you had the 1861 census, and then all the other material as well, just drawing on what we can and using the timeline mechanic as a narrative. Obviously gives you a structure as well, so it gives you a beginning, middle, and end point as well. So it's nice to have that. And so yeah, it was, you know, a really overall a very interesting exercise in, you know, sifting, gathering, trying to work out a narrative and story, and knowing what to cut and what to keep in, and wrap it all in a structure that was sort of compelling for people.
Yeah, that timeline that the exhibition covers is really quite vast, but I think it's great how it starts with the Doomsday Book, because so many people equate you know, the start of medieval history with that period. And I think that it's, in many ways, it's the first documentation for many places around England.
Yeah, and knowing that there's more pigs than people in Hinxton is mildly amusing as well.
Not anymore.
Yeah, not anymore, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, thinking of that vast timeline, I can imagine that was pretty challenging for you when you're sourcing visual material. I mean, you've got a lot of ground to cover.
Yeah, and there's a lot of the materials obviously missing. There's not much from the 17th century to the 19th century, so there wasn't much artwork or anything to pull on. You had the reference to, you know, a pretty neat box and Trout Hall, but none of that. Well, I certainly couldn't find any of that material. Maybe Catherine's probably got something that we didn't. I don't know, but so you have to sort of start visually from the 19th century, and everything before that was sort of this Doomsday Book, and then. You know, the house changed hands so many different times. So many different families that weren't mentioned in the film. The house moved between. It had connections with the colleges as well. I think it was Magdalen College and maybe Trinity as well. So we left that out. So there's lots of things we left out because you just can't fit it all in. And then once you get into you know, the Frevels and the Pompeian rooms, things start to become more visual. You can bring in more materials, letters and kind of the census and the paintings and things like that. So that's sort of the jumping off point from all the visual treatment. And then of course we go into the house as well. And I'm glad we found, you know, that Symphony No. 1 by Schubert as well, Robert Schumann, and that kind of tied into that narrative as well. So, yeah.
I mean, regarding the extensive period of history you have covered, what did you find particularly fascinating about the history of Hinxton? I mean, maybe that was the pigs, maybe it was something else. And what was your favourite aspect of it?
I think just going through the Georgian, Pompeian Room, seeing all those paintings, that inspiration that the family took from their travels around Europe, that was fascinating. And every time you go into that room, I think a 3D a link has been shared on the discussion there. That gives you a real good sense of like every time you look into that room, there's something different. You pick out a little feature. That was really interesting. And also, I think as you're doing these things, you're trying to find stories within the wider narrative. And I think with the Robinson sisters, and you see those old photographs of the Robinson sisters and the letters that went back and forth. That was quite fascinating, and trying to read cursive as well, trying to read the cursive and understand what was going on. A lot of the letters are to do with the legalese and the transfer of ownership, but you see there was a few letters between the sisters and their friends, and the fact that they got to stay in the house whilst all the soldiers were there, that for me was like quite a touching moment, that they got to stay there, and that, rather than being kicked out when the Second World War happened and the soldiers took over. I imagine that for them was quite a poignant moment in their lives, because they've lived there their whole life, and they get to stay there during that period. So that touched my kind of imagination when I was thinking about that.
Yeah, I can imagine. Yeah. Thank you so much, Colin. That was really interesting, and it's fabulous to hear your perspective, and congratulations on such a wonderful film as well.
Thank you.
So we've got loads of questions. I think we can almost go back to the beginning and direct some of them to Giorgio. So one of the first questions for Giorgio: how many Pompeian rooms exist in country houses in the UK today? Which I think is a really interesting question, actually, because obviously if this grand tour was so influential, were there other examples?
No, absolutely. I mean, there's quite a few. However, it's quite impossible to say how many. I mean, there's many famous ones like Ickworth Hall, or Packington Hall as well. It's got a great one. It's hard to say, because I think because of the kind of very strong colours employed in these rooms, the Pompeian style really was relatively short-lived, and so many Pompeian rooms across the country later became redecorated, like even the room at Hinxton was covered up with wallpaper at the end of towards the end of the 1800s, and when Tube Investment Limited bought the hall in 1958, they rediscovered the wall paintings afterwards, after stripping the room of wallpaper. So it's very hard. It's a very hard question to answer, especially because a lot of these rooms and houses are inaccessible today.
Do you think that the Genome Centre's restored them, to their former glory, or do you think that there's something sort of?
Absolutely. I mean, I think when they stripped the wall paintings off, the wallpaper off the walls, most of the wall paintings survived relatively well, apart from those on the north wall, which is the wall to the left, which has the two large landscape panels. So that had to kind of be recreated from scratch, quite accurately, I would say. But yeah, they did a great job. The renovation was carried out by art conservator Pauline Plummer in 1966. It took about 14 months and cost over £150,000. And yeah, I mean, I'm so glad it happened, because I wouldn't be here today.
Katrina Robinson would like to know, Giorgio, what was the most interesting thing that you found when you were researching the Pompeian Room?
Gosh, I mean, apart from the findings that I actually wrote about, I think the most interesting thing was actually coming across the travel diaries of Edward Green, the father of the builder of the Pompeian Room. I discovered about 8 months of travel diaries from 1792, across France, Holland, Germany, Austria, and Italy. And they were real kind of revelation of characters. with, you know, very interesting quotes and observations. He seemed to have been a very opinionated man. At one point, I think he compares St. Peter's in Rome to St. Paul's Basilica in London, and essentially says that the English St. Paul's is so much better than St. Peter's in Rome.
Wow, it's quite an assertion.
Yeah.
Okay. Wonderful. Thank you, Giorgio, and thank you so much for coming tonight. Everything was fascinating that you.
Thanks for having me.
Lots of questions for Twigs. Katrina has two. Would any wine or cider have been produced from the walled gardens, and what kind of meals would have been produced from the gardens at Hinxton?
There we go. Wine and cider, I think definitely, because they definitely had a vine house. We know that because we know that later in the 19th century, there's a description again, yes, another sales document of a 50-foot vinery. So they're definitely going to be producing some wine in there. So 50-foot of vinery, but also cider, because this range of apples, these choicest apples would have included cider apples. What did the meals? Well, the meals would have varied enormously from the 18th century origin, when undoubtedly they would have included fish with them, but not grown in the kitchen garden, but all the way through to the Victorian. Taste in food vary enormously, but what we should bear in mind is that the head gardener is going to be producing a much wider range of foods, a much wider range of vegetables than the cottage gardens, the villagers would have been producing. So typically the head gardener using the stove houses and the heated frames. We know that they had forcing pits. Maybe they had things like pineapples that they were forcing. By the Victorian period, a lot of head gardeners would even produce things like aubergines, for example.
I mean, I'd like to know, Twigs, if you wouldn't mind answering one of my questions about who would have worked in the garden. Do you have any information about that?
Well, we do, and that actually is one of my favourite bits. In fact, we're back to the personal and the education and the employment and the link with the villagers here, because of course they are drawn, as in fact we saw a little bit in the film, they are drawn largely from the village. We know that by the time you get into the 1930s, for example, you've got two members of a family called the Page family. Jack Page and his brother Albert were working there. They came straight from school, which was very, very typical of gardeners. They were often allowed to come early and leave school early if they were going to go and be gardeners at the big house, not just at Hinxton, but everywhere. So I've had this from other places I've researched. And obviously we have in the census, we have lists of more names of gardeners and head gardeners working there. Often it runs in families. You'll have an entire family, you know, where all the male members, I'm afraid the females weren't allowed to, but all the male members would go and work in the walled garden. That's an aspect I absolutely love. So I really would like to find out more about the people that actually worked in the gardens. Who knows, as I said, maybe they've had something named after them.
Another very good question from Chris Elliott, who would like to know how usual it is to have a walled garden with only 3 protected sides, as the current walled orchard is open overlooking the lakes at Hinxton. So that's from Sue and Chris Elliott.
So interesting that Georgio mentioned Ickworth, because Ickworth has a walled garden that is only walled on 3 sides, and it overlooks a decorative lake or river, you know, a diverted ornamental piece of water, exactly the same way. Has a lovely slope down and a view across to the parkland. My thoughts on it, and there are others, the gardens at Heligan, for example, which everybody will know of, that walled garden is only on 3 sides. It's actually the west side that's open, so that's kind of a little bit safer, so that you wouldn't want the east side open for the east winds or the north side open, but the west side being open is probably fine in terms of productivity. And I'm guessing here, and we don't have any evidence prior to the mid-19th century for any mapping, but I'm guessing here that that one was probably open when it was first built. And that association is with the idea of seeing the view of the park, having the dove house close. You've got the trout lodge, you've got fish, you've got doves, you've got the walled garden, and it's open to give you this view downwards. So I wouldn't be at all surprised if that had always only been three-sided. And as I say, similarities to Ickworth. So I'm really, with the Pompeian, room being similar as well, I'm just seeing them visiting Ickworth here.
One final question for you, Twix. There's lots of interest in the walled garden. I suppose the walled garden had a west wall at some point, and was that taken down for the construction of the watercourse?
Well, that's the thing we don't quite know, because we don't have enough plans of that early period. We know that the watercourse is certainly there by the 1830s. Actually, it's there before that. One of our main problems, I don't want to get into real archival detail here, but when you can clearly see the watercourse on the plans, but when people draw around an area of land to say this is the area that is the kitchen garden, we cannot tell the difference between if they're drawing on the map to say it is walled all the way around, or this is the area of the walled garden. Actually, I'm frantically doing this, realizing that bit of my hand is off camera, but if you see what I mean. So we cannot be sure whether the west wall was ever there or whether it was always three-sided. To be honest, I would take a punt at it always being three-sided with the view down to the river.
I did say there was one last question about the walled garden, but I evidently lied, because there is one final question.
Walled gardens are so popular. And don't forget, there was the lost walled garden, that little walled garden that we don't have anymore as well. So as well as the three-sided one and the top part of that, which is technically four-sided, we also have the little walled garden. So there's lots to ask about.
But so Katrina would like to know if food from the walled garden would have been shared with the village?
Well, probably was during the wartime. And in fact, the billeted soldiers may well have taken over the walled garden, because the Ministry of Food arranged for any head gardener that had been taken into the military to control gardens. However, in terms of the village eating produce, what they wonderfully did in the 19th century was they actually encourage the villagers to grow their own food. So they started a cottage garden society, and also gave the village allotments. And believe it or not, there was also a dairy cow arrangement. So there was a dairy club, which is one of the first dairy clubs I've actually come across factually, though I knew about them theoretically. So I'm very excited about that. And it seems as though the people in the hall were really encouraging the villagers to be self-sufficient, which is a whole different question as well, because that was a morality issue. During the Victorian period, people were terribly worried about villagers getting drunk. And so they would provide them with cottage garden societies and allotments and encouragement to grow their own food, because it kept them out of the pub. So, which is rather wonderful. And indeed, we have a report from one of the cottage garden, they used to have garden competitions that were held at Hinxton Hall. And one of the very, very first, in 1869, there's a little note at the bottom of the report, and it says that all went off well with no disturbances amongst the population. And what that really means is nobody got drunk, which is great.
Yeah, drunk gardening, not sure how well that would go down. So Catherine, Paul Allen would like to know, where is the exhibition? Can the public see it? Because he worked at Hinxton with TI from 1958 until it closed.
Yeah, that's fantastic, Paul. I'm sure the team, Katrina and the team, would love to hear some of your reminiscences about it. The exhibition is open, I think, spring 22. It's in the atrium, the entrance of the hall itself, and the circulation areas of that and its use as a conference centre. But you might also be interested in an installation which went in to celebrate the 25th anniversary of the Human Genome Project at the hall, which is a kind of ghost building. It's tracing the frontage of the Tube Investments building, which was demolished a few years after Sanger moved in to make way for the new laboratories. But there's some more material associated with that, and it's just a great period of the campus's history. So please go and reminisce, fill your boots. It's fantastic.
Catherine, would you remind us which part of the exhibition that you liked best as well? Because we just have a question about that.
I've already mentioned the infantry. Thank you, Richard Herbert. You're quite right. I'm very much a jack of all trades and master of none. So thank you for pulling me up on that. The cavalry, not infantry. I've done it again, haven't I? So yeah, one thing I'll just stop digging. One thing I really enjoyed was the talking point about the early history of the site. We sort of dived in with the archaeological finds and decided to replicate some Anglo-Saxon loom weights, which we got made, and they were fantastic. And then we sat down and thought, well, how are we going to display them? And that just opened this whole rabbit hole of incredible information about early textiles. And I watched a lot of YouTube videos, and it was amazing how to create fabric from nettle fibers and all this amazing stuff about how incredibly labor intensive that was. And we really enjoyed that process of working out how to display those and get them up on a wall in a vaguely, hopefully authentic way. So I really enjoyed that.
And another slightly more tricky question for you, Catherine. I'm not sure if you'd be able to answer this or not, but Chris Elliott would like to know how many people did the estate employ at its height? So, around the turn of the 20th century up to the First World War. I don't know if anybody else can answer that.
Off the top of my head, I'm afraid not.
I can only say that typically for just a walled garden, for every acre, there would have to be a man and a boy, or a man and an assistant. But that would change if you had, as we know, they did stove houses and hot houses, because you would have to have a man for the hot houses. And then, of course, you've got the wider parkland and gardens and the estate and indeed the timber. So, you'd be looking at maybe 10 what were called out of house. But, that's a very, very rough guide. And it may be that they had less than that.
Yeah, you can also pause the video on those on the staffing list and count up the amount of names on there, and it includes all the gardeners and the chefs and stuff. I think it's probably 15, I would reckon. That was 1861, I think that was done.
Thank you. So I think the final question, Colin, while you're there, is for tonight, is directed at you. Katrina would like to know which film you've enjoyed most making and why.
Katrina's asked me a really difficult question. Thanks, Katrina. So for those who are watching and don't know, there's actually 3 films, so it's a trio of films. So I've worked lucky to work across all 3 films. And I'm going to be a bit of a bad egg. I'm going to say actually Tube Investments was my favourite film, because it's the people we managed to speak to, people who actually worked there. And I think that's about bringing history to life. And for me, that's the most powerful thing you can do is. And we have 2 gentlemen in the film, scientists. They're in their 90s now, I believe, who are both in that film. We managed to talk to them, capture their thoughts, and also a gentleman that works on the engineering side as well, who lives locally as well. So we were lucky to capture them talk to them through the pandemic via Zoom, and they feature in the second film. So I think that's kind of what trumps it for me, just being able to have those sorts of conversations. It's very powerful. Obviously, it's harder to have conversations with people in the first film. They're not there anymore. So yeah, I hope that answers the question.
Thank you so much, Colin, and thank you so much to everyone. I'm sure I can answer for everybody at home as well, who's watching, that I've learned so much from all of you, and we're so grateful that you took the time this evening to come and talk about your expertise and your research. And as I said, I think every time I look at an apple, I'll look at it in a very different way now, after spending time with you all. It was lovely to meet you. And with that, I'm going to hand back to Julian. Thank you so much for a lovely evening.
So huge thank you to our chair, Helen Carr, and to all of our amazing panel, Catherine Helcrow, Colin Ramsey, Georgio Bol, Twigs Way, and Max Brown, for giving us just so much to think about. And I hope everyone watching at home or wherever you're watching enjoyed it as much as we did. I think one thing that really struck me listening to the amazing stories is how we as humans are always striving to understand ourselves in the context of the world around us. And that the history of the Hall in some ways illustrates how we've tried to do that at different points in our history, from the Grand Tour, or gap year, as Helen called it, as I'll always think of it now, that the wealthy could take to see the wonders of the ancient world, and led to the creation of the Pompeii Room, to the massive books of different types of apple that Twigs referred to, trying to capture the diversity of the world as we understood it then, to how we're trying to understand it now, as Max discussed, through genome sequencing and the Darwin Tree of Life project, seeking to understand how species are different from each other, and ultimately being able to trace the evolution of life on Earth. As is always the case, there were lots of questions, more than we could get through in the time, but hopefully we managed to cover lots of the themes you wanted to hear about. And if you enjoyed this, please join us at the next Hinxton Hall event, Engineering Our Future, which will cover the major changes that took place on campus after World War II, when the research and manufacturing company Tube Investments came to the site. And it will take place on the 20th of October at 6 p.m. I'd also really encourage all of you to explore the Georgians, Jet Engines and Genes exhibition online at the Genome Gallery, and links to that have been posted in the chat, which explore many of the areas we touched on tonight in more detail. As one of the questions asked, when can we see this in person? We hope that we can welcome you back in person to the gallery and to the campus before too long. But in the meantime, do check out the websites, where you'll find the link to sign up to the next event, and you can sign up for other events. We'll also put links in the chat to useful resources, and we'll also post a short survey. Please, if you have a couple of minutes, can you stay online for that? Because we'd really like to hear your feedback. It only helps us make the next events even better. If you'd like to watch this event again or share with your friends, we'll be posting it on our Genome Gallery website in a few days' time. So again, a huge thank you to all of our participants, to everyone for joining. This has been part of the Open Cambridge and Heritage Open Days initiatives. Take care, everyone, stay safe, and look forward to seeing you again online and one day in person. Good night.